and welcome to another one of our Exeter Institutogram conversations with me, Sajjad Rizvi from the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. I will today be in conversation with my colleague, Professor Nandini Chatterjee, who is at Exeter as well in the history department, and we'll be talking about her new book, which is called Negotiating Mughal Law, which just came out recently with Cambridge University Press. And so hopefully it will be, I'm just patching her in. Hello, Nandini. It seems to be, we're connecting. Oh, how is that? Okay, let's try again. Where is she? Anyway, as I was saying, we're going to be talking about her book, Negotiating Mughal Law, which is a microhistory based on a particular archive of a family from a place called Thar in Malwa in Western India. So, Nandini, where are you? Okay, I've just requested her. Let's see what happens now. Ah, there you are.
Hi.
Okay, hi, yeah. I got a bit worried when I first came up as you declined. I was like, oh, that's a bit
Wasn't
strange.
intentional, I can assure you.
Okay, well, welcome, Nandini, to this conversation. It's a pleasure to be discussing your new book
Thank you,
with
Sajjad.
you. I just did a very brief introduction saying what the book is and the fact that it just came out with Cambridge about a month ago, perhaps even less than a month ago. So I guess we'll kick off like we normally do with this by asking you basically why you wrote this book.
Um, so there's a long answer to that question in the introduction to the book, which talks about the various historiographies I've tried to address. But I think I should actually say what might sound like a flippant answer at the outset. I wrote it because it was such fun to write.
Well, that's always
And
good.
it has been a wonderful endeavor. It's been going for a long time. It has been an exercise in detection. And I've been following breadcrumbs in bits and bobs, and every time I thought I reached the destination, I hadn't. The destination was further. And as I describe in the book, and as we will discuss, there are various archives that kept opening up. So it was almost like an Ali Baba's cave that kept drawing me in. And I must say, I'm shamelessly romantic about this exercise. And so, yes, I mean, more seriously, I wanted to address what I thought was a very exciting historiography, which was that of Islamic law in society. But I felt that South Asia was such a big gap. And I always feel very dissatisfied as to that, as in one of, if not the most important Islamic empires of the world. And it doesn't get the central place that it deserves in the historiography of Islamic law. And I can see why that would be the case with the present understanding of Islamic law that is tagged on more to community identity and processes. I can see why it would become a story of Muslims reforming their way of living in the world
Yeah,
rather than about law in Islamic empires. So this is a story
yeah.
which is in many ways very early modern. It is about middling sorts of people dealing with an Islamic empire, the kind you are perhaps quite familiar with in an Orhan Pamuk way,
Right.
but this time it's in India.
Cool. I mean, I think you already raised a number of really interesting questions there, which is like, for example, what do we mean by a law? What is an archive? What's the point of history? And what do we
Yes.
mean by the term Islam? I think these are some of the big issues. But what I found really interesting reading the introduction and the conclusion, which every good
As you
student
do.
does to begin with, is that there's, as you mentioned, this enthusiasm for what you're doing. And it's always good to see people actually enthusiastic and not just writing because they have to for promotion or because they have to publish.
Yeah.
So I think that enthusiasm, and particularly enthusiasm for types of documents which others would be kind of astonished that you'd be enthusiastic about.
Yes, well, so I have a masochistic side to me, but I also follow the money. I am very hard-nosed. So while I find the delights of poetry and the intricacies of the Persian world's culture charming and beautiful, but I really like to follow the money.
Yeah.
And the money is actually encoded in the kinds of documents that I look at, which, by the way, are not actually non-cultural objects at all. Because if you actually place them in their own context, things such as imperial orders, which I also deal with,
Yeah.
are the kinds of stuff that people have accorded quite fetishistic cultural value to, in fact,
Yes.
such that people display them framed on their walls. Now, that kind of fetishistic attachment to these objects has become community specific. But
I don't know if you've ever seen outside the director's office at the Institute in Exeter,
yes,
we have
yes,
a Farman
yes,
framed.
yes, indeed.
So, yeah.
With all the changes in the geopolitics that has taken place, it's still the Mughal Farman. Indeed. So that is exactly what I am referring to right now. But legal documents are cryptic, they're short and they're functional.
Yeah.
But precisely because they are cryptic, there is so much fun in decoding them.
Right.
And that is where your social history is. And
Sure.
actually, that leads us, and as you will give me the cue, I would like to talk about those bigger issues as well, as in
Yes,
why I would look at such materials.
exactly. So, as you said, why these particular sources and why what you call a microhistory?
Could I start with the question of why law and what is law?
Okay,
I
sure.
think I can kind of come back to the issue of microhistory in a bit.
Okay.
So these materials, answering the question of why these materials.
Yeah.
So I wanted to write a story about Islamic law in South Asia.
Right.
But I didn't want just to be writing, or I did not at all wish to be writing about the scholarly reformers who have been the heroes of the excellent stories that have been told
Yeah.
about Islamic reform from 19th century onwards. I wanted to tell a different kind of story
Right.
altogether. And so the reference back to Pamuk and the Ottoman social history
Yeah.
bit comes in here. So, of course, I thought that having read, if not even a tenth of all the literature that's out there, but a sufficient portion of it, of Islamic legal historiography, I thought there would be those registers, the sigillat,
Yeah.
as you have in the Ottoman case. And these would somehow tag on to jurisprudential texts. And through these documents, the regular registers of legal disputes, I'd be able to tell how the scholars thought about it and how the ordinary people were dealing with it.
Right.
The fact remains that despite some speculation that certain qazis, may have maintained private divans, no sigillat has been found for South Asia so far.
Right.
And I have no hesitation in actually saying that. There's been absolutely none.
Right.
Therefore, the documents must have been somewhere else. I don't think there can be such selective and complete destruction of a genre of documents altogether. Um, what I came to believe is actually a huge amount of documentation was actually maintained by households. And the
Right.
metaphor that I offer in my book is that of the way of medical archiving in South Asia. Even now, there isn't a central registry of medical records. What you
Right.
have is meticulous, but what might look to a modern eye unsystematic archiving of medical records. So people keep amulets of various kinds of things and like quackery together with modern medicine and prescription and injections and so on.
Yeah.
And my feeling when I started opening up these household archives is that this was exactly the legal counterpart of that medical archive.
Okay.
So you have legal orders, which are like charters, creating grants or revoking them or buttressing them, etc. Then you actually have various kinds of records of disputes. So not
Yeah.
sigillat, but various kind of testimonial documents relating to these disputes. And then you have further orders, but you also have interpersonal contracts of various kinds. And you really do have to read all this together
Right.
as an archive. So to come to your question of the archive, you
Yeah.
have to put the archive back together and
Right.
not read these documents in isolation. And that's how you actually begin to see what Mughal law was like.
And I mean, what accounts for the fragmentation? Um, you mentioned that you find documents in the Dar al-Islamiyya in Kuwait.
Yes,
There's some, of course, in the family records and
yes,
elsewhere,
yes.
National Archives. So, what accounts for the fragmentation of it?
To a great extent, I think the fragmentation happened with the end of the Persianate world as it existed. So with the loss of reading ability in Persian,
Hmm.
the bulk of these documents became illegible, but relatively recently in history. So
Right.
it's my speculation that it's around the 1940s to 50s that these documents became largely illegible to members of these lineages. And so what happened in this particular case, it's easier to actually trace what happened, although there is no outright acquisition record of this.
Hmm.
But a portion of these records was either sold or gifted
Right.
to the National Archives in Delhi.
Yeah.
But very interestingly, there was a fragmentation of the records based on their language.
Right.
So the portion that was fully Persian and looked more high status, and let's call it more quote unquote Islamic because it had no Indic element in
Yeah.
it. So it was all like Perso Arabic script.
Hmm.
So 42 of those were purchased by the Dar al Asar al Islamia,
Okay.
and that accords well with their stated project on their website, which is
Yeah.
curating Islamic culture from around the world.
Yeah.
Which is a valuable project. But then what happens is that the Indic part of the story gets completely cut out. So
Right.
if you were to only read those Parvanas, you would think that there existed these Mughal nobles. They only wrote in Persian and they gave a certain kind of directions. You wouldn't know, for instance, that the same people actually gifted, transacted, pawn stuff among each other. There were most of them were Hindus, in fact, which is the other point that I would like to make. That they were quite au courant actually with Islamic terminology.
Hmm.
But they went to a number of forums, including that of nobles' courts, qazis' courts. They used curses and injunctions that they seemed to make up themselves. They petitioned secular authorities, if you like, but they also went to various kinds of religious authorities, most importantly, though, the Qazi.
Right.
So what happens is a portion is gifted to the National Archives because the family sees no interest in it.
Yeah.
A portion is acquired, perhaps sold at
Yeah.
a reasonable sum to a museum abroad.
Hmm.
And the
As
bit
cultural
that
artifacts.
that's right. And the bit that looks the most scrappy is the bit that actually remains with the family. And
Right.
that is the portion that is most linguistically exciting. And it actually records the transition from the Mughal Empire into the Maratha Empire into the British Empire.
Okay. Cool. So, I mean, obviously, you said you first came across some of the fragments in the National Archives.
That's right.
I mean, in many, and how it was kind of serendipitous that you found these various other elements. I mean, that sort of, I mean, that indicates the basic difficulty, right, of this sort of material. I mean, there are, recently I read Nicholas Dirks's autobiography of an archive, which is a very
Yes.
interesting account, and
Yes.
that talks about the potential of being daunted by an archive in two different ways. One is turning up and realizing there's just so much material, which you mentioned
Yeah.
as well. If you want to
Yes.
write this account of Mughal law in its entirety, I mean, that's a massively daunting task because of the
Yes.
vastness of the archive.
Yes.
And then the other is the element of the fragment of the archive and realizing
Yeah.
this is something part of a bigger whole. But then how do you get around making those links, and how do you, in a sense, reconstruct and produce
Yeah.
that? Right.
Well, I mean, my answer to that is like while remaining grateful for the things that have fallen in place,
Mm.
I would also like to say that there is actually no such thing as pure serendipity.
Of course,
Things
yeah.
happen to people who go looking for them.
Yeah, you
I
put an
wouldn't
idea.
necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this kind of enormously obsessive and time-consuming project on a regular basis because it has taken 8 years to put together.
Cool.
Yeah, so that's, and I think I actually worked very fast. So yeah, I found these fragments in a sense in the National Archives. But for that, as I describe in the book, the National Archives' acquired collections consist of a number of household collections
Yeah.
whose integrity has been lost. They have all been separated and then put together again in a chronological fashion. So if you wanted to study so actually this kind of fragmentation lends itself to a impersonal study of the state
Yeah.
because you can ignore the people and you can actually look at things chronologically, and then you can say, well, this is how the Mughal state behaves, by which actually people mean that certain high level officials and the emperors behave in certain contexts, because the state is much more, as we all know, than the regime and its top incumbents, right? But if you they have sometime, and this is a pattern actually across Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, that sometime in the 1950s and 60s there were these activist archivists, for want of
Yeah.
a better word, who
Okay.
actually acquired these household collections. I think it was part of nationalist projects in each case.
Yeah.
And then they actually had the linguistic skills as well as the time and commitment to catalog these at a level that we don't do anymore.
Mm.
So we don't just have lists, we actually have extremely detailed catalogs. And my work, and of those who want to do this kind of stuff, is entirely dependent on those catalogs to start with. Because those catalogs, while they're in paper, so you can't really do searches on them, so you really do have to read every single entry in 8 volumes as a start. But then you can start finding some names, some places, and that's exactly how I started to put this family back together.
Okay.
And when I had 80 of those, then step two was to go back to Irfan Habib, because everyone has to go back to Irfan Habib, because that is the encyclopedia of Mughal history. And as expected, but it's really amazing that everything is in that book. I found a footnote in Irfan Habib's book, which was to the Dhar Zamindars. And it said that these Dhar Zamindars, and Dhar is the district where this landlord lineage was
Yeah.
based, these Dhar Zamindars had produced certain documents which were currently in Kuwait. So I wrote to Kuwait. I initially did not get a response because I was writing to the wrong people.
Mm.
But then I have a friend, an eminent legal historian himself, Fahad Bishara,
Yes.
who has a friend out there. And then we got in
Yeah.
touch, and the museum was excellent, and they sent me all the documents. And then I could see, in fact, there were seals. There were documents which were the originals, of which the copies were in the National Archives. There was no question that they had been part of this archive. But I think the third part is the craziest,
Yeah.
because I actually decided to go to this town of Dhar
Yeah.
and take pictures. And there are some really embarrassing moments out there where I actually got the driver to drive to this village called Ahu, which exists. There is no proper road. And there were villages whose names I was following from my documents. And there were signs on the road saying that there will be a road built here in the next 5 years, according to the Prime Minister's project or whatever. Anyway, so we turn up at this village, and it's really hopeless. There's a Jain temple, once again, that's a sign, I think. And there's one shop. And then actually my husband went and asked the shopkeeper, is there anybody who would know older people?
Mm.
And the shopkeeper said, like, exactly how old? And he said 400 years.
Yes.
And in the famous Malvi hospitality, actually, they didn't say insane people stone them out of town, but they said, well, we are not that educated, but you should probably talk either to the trustee of the Jain temple or this guy called Puar, who is the MLA out here.
Right.
And because nothing in South Asia ever changes,
Yeah.
So actually, the Maratha princes who took charge in Dhar district in 1733
Hmm.
are still the MLAs. I mean, their descendants are still the MLAs.
Yeah. Well,
So I found them.
that's how these things work.
So
Uh,
that's how the archive came together.
Someone's actually commented, I mean, this should be a straightforward question, but are any of those records or documents digitized, or are they digitizable?
Oh,
Um,
indeed. Yes. Okay. Is there a further part to that question?
no, I think it's
Uh,
that I'm assuming that might be part of your ERC project.
yes, that's
Yeah,
right. So actually, just before logging on to the to Instagram, I
yeah,
was working on the website that we are creating, which is Law Forms.
right,
And we are working to upload on there images of all the documents that I have used,
right,
except unfortunately the ones from National Archives, because I can't get the permission for those. I
okay,
have the permission for the family and for Kuwait documents,
right.
full transcriptions and full translations, and they will be completely free and open to public.
Sure. Well, I think what we'll do after is I'll post a link so it'll be easier if anyone wants to follow up.
Right. It's not ready to go live yet, but maybe the project blog can be linked so
Okay,
people
sure.
can,
If
yeah.
you just, or even you can do it yourself. If you post it on Instagram and then I can link it, or on Twitter, yeah,
Sure.
we'll do that. That's easy enough. Cool. Um, shall we come back to this question of what the law is?
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So we talked of the archives, but
Yeah.
not essentially of the law. But I think I was trying to make a connection and I got a bit distracted. So I started with the idea that I want to find Islamic law in South Asia.
Yeah.
And the story that I thought that in terms of sources, if I did not want to look at jurisprudence as in the scholarly development of the law, and I wanted to actually look at actual records of disputes
Mm.
or orders, then I should find Sijillat. Now,
Right.
since I did not find Sijillat, and I'm more or less convinced that they don't exist, I think I have found what consist of legal records in the South Asian
Mm.
case, and which are what look like eclectic collections of orders, of transactional records, and a variety of contracts, including contracts with the state.
Right.
So, given that, it seems to me that it's a totality which is best conceived of as Mughal law. I do not want to actually take the Islamic out of Mughal law because a great deal of the say about a third of it, of the
Yeah.
documents that I look at, are completely recognizable Islamic legal forms,
Mm.
which could be from anywhere in the Islamic world. So they are sale deeds, they are pawn deeds, there are various kinds of testimonial documents, and so on. But these are premised on the fact that people have certain titles to certain properties or certain perquisites or certain obligations,
Mm.
in fact. And those rights and those obligations were created by the royal orders or the sub-royal orders, which I think form part of this legal matrix.
Right.
So I tried thinking in terms of jurisdictions, but
Yeah.
not in the Lauren Benton way, but I tried to think of it in a spatial fashion, as in Daira, which is still, it has a very similar notion, but it's much less about words and more about space. And space that is inhabited on the one hand, and
Mm.
space that is controlled on the other.
Right.
So it's powerfully structured space. So there are various dairas, I think, within which legal activity, legal actors are located. And in a district, I think the Qazi's daira is a very important daira.
Mm.
But the Jagirdar's daira, as in the Mughal officials' daira, is a very, very powerful one. And
Yeah.
you can see that one relates to the other and they overlap. They are not independent of each other. So to give an example, so when a landlord, for instance, dies and somebody else succeeds, then not only does the Jagirdar make an order, but then he also instructs the Qazi very often to actually draw up the legal documents necessary for securing the title. So
Right.
these are overlapping dairas in a sense, which suggests to me, and what I find really evocative also is the way in which these documents repeatedly use the word Sharia.
Mm.
But they use the word Sharia in the adjectival form, if you like.
Mm.
So Sharian or Shariai.
Mm.
So in the sense, which translates very nicely as legal.
Yeah, legal
Uh,
legitimacy. Yeah,
in our case, the people,
mm.
if we are talking of legitimacy, but it's
Yeah,
not just legitimacy that is normative, it's not legitimacy that is also about effective.
yeah,
So these are enforceable, disputable, recordable kinds of rights and obligations being transferred, recorded, disputed, etc. in these documents. And these people, and the vast majority of them, happen to be Hindus as well. So I think it's a complex which may look to us as eclectic right now, but in order to really grasp it, I think we need to move beyond the notion of Islam plus.
mm.
I did actually start thinking of Islamic law beyond Islam, and is that the right way of thinking about it? And in a future work, I might actually write a book called Islamic Law Beyond Islam.
Right,
But for now, I've decided to go with Mughal law
right.
because
Okay.
I think it is that particular imperial setting that creates a particular kind of Persianate matrix,
Mm.
which brings in certain kinds of conventions. So I try to show in the book also the specific role that Rajputs and Rajput conventions play. And it is a very Mughal thing as well.
Right,
Were we to look at southern Indian sultanates, then the complex is quite different.
right.
Um,
I mean, it kind of begs the question of, yeah, exactly what term would you use? Would you use Islamic? You mentioned at one point Islamic hate, and you also mentioned the late Shahab Ahmed's kind of issue with Islamic
yeah,
hate.
yeah.
Um, I mean, it's especially since Persianate Islamicate are being so widely used for South Asia.
Mhm.
Uh, some people might be kind of surprised that you would describe this as Islamic law in that sense,
Yeah,
when you have an alternative label that you could use.
yes. Well, I mean, like all of us, we are offered some capacity with these suffixes of the eights, as in stuff that is not quite doctrinal in a sense, but is somehow associated with the core doctrine.
Yeah.
That concept is there, obviously. And
Mm,
Hodgson's whole idea was that Islamic is incorrectly applied to a variety of institutions, locations, etc. I needn't rehash this for you.
mm,
So, since we don't talk of Christian architecture necessarily when we are talking of forts, there is no reason we have to talk about Islamic X, Y, or Z
yeah.
when we are talking of things that don't have any necessary connection with Islam. That
Right.
argument is harder to make in connection with law,
Mm,
because whether or not architecture has a necessary, or certain architectural features have a necessary connection with Islam, law is certainly viewed as having an intrinsic connection with
mm,
Islam, or at least like law that calls itself Sharia. In this, however, I did not find Shahab Ahmed useful.
mm,
Not that I did not find that work inspiring, I did. Shahab Ahmed's work is really, really important for understanding that we need to think of the complexity of South Asian Islam in all its variety,
yeah.
and to think of it capaciously. But the one thing he rejects in his bid to do that, and I think that's a very modernist imperative, is law.
Yeah,
Uh,
I mean, that's. I think that's you make the very useful point precisely that, and legal specialists have made this as well, that he has this very simplistic notion of what Islamic law is, because he's trying to set
yeah,
up a straw man, which is very easy to criticize.
yes.
But actually, and to a certain extent, there's a distinction between, as you've mentioned, the law of kind of normative textbooks and of legal theory, and law
Yes.
is actually practice and then, I guess, expressed in these sorts of documents.
That's absolutely right. Having said all that, I'm also uncomfortable with completely ignoring the very significant Islamic elements in
Mm,
the documents that we are
yeah,
looking at. So I don't want to look at them as purely debris that is carried over
yeah,
meaninglessly from the proper Islamic legal system, because I don't think there is any such thing.
mm,
I think every Islamic legal system forms in its own environment. And by this, I mean that when there are terminologies, forms, and practices and institutions, so terminologies such as, for instance, diya,
Yeah.
the blood money,
Yeah.
payment compensation. When we have certain forms such as Rehan or Bai,
Yeah.
when we have certain institutions such as that of the Qazi or Mutasib, then we cannot just say, as has been a sort of implicit or explicit assumption in Mughal studies, that there was no Islamic law in Mughal India, or if there was, it was limited to occasional um, flirting of the emperors, if you
Yeah.
like, with
Ceremonial.
certain
Yeah.
hardcore, the kind of
Rituals.
Aurangzeb period, etc., and so on. Or the other thing, which is an idealized vision of the Mughal past,
Right.
which is that Islamic law existed and it was very plastic and it was all very accommodating, it wasn't rigid at all. Well, if it was completely plastic, it wouldn't be law and it wouldn't be recognizable at all to anybody.
Yeah.
And it is not plastic. It is highly recognizable. The forms used are very formulaic. The way the scribes write them, whoever they are, is actually very correct and would hold up in all other places within the Islamic world. So I wanted to underline that as well.
But I mean, that raises also an interesting question about the nature of that kind of, I guess, what you might call that Islamicate or Persianate training, right?
Yes,
Because so perhaps the individual theological or confessional affiliations of the people drawing up the documents is not that important. It's the
yes,
fact they have a common form of training in how in administration. I mean, the making of the Munshi kind of argument
yes,
about how
yes.
this is one way in which forms of Islamic normativity disperse or sort of spread out in that way.
Yes, that's right. And that argument is something that obviously I've been building on. And my favorite kind of the book, as the book might show, I have a weakness for Bollywood, and I think everything is illustrated with reference to Bollywood.
Right.
So actually, if you watch the movie Tanu Weds, Manu Returns, there's this famous scene where there is a notarial
Not
bazaar.
familiar with that.
I really recommend it. Excellent acting by
Put a link
Kangana
in.
Rao.
Put a link in, and we can follow it.
The point is, there's a notarial bazaar where a certain disgruntled husband goes to not a lawyer, but essentially a scribe with a typewriter,
Yeah.
saying, I have a dispute with my wife. What do I do? And then the scribe actually interrogates him. He actually asks, so how bad is this dispute?
Hmm.
Is this like a real dispute? And then he says, so do you really want to get rid of her? And he says, well, I said, right, so I've got it. It's not really a divorce letter we're looking for a letter of another kind, which is obviously of a lower order. And so I think this notary actually represents the notaries of our Mughal past. You
Yeah.
would go to the notary. I want to create some kind of a gift deed,
Yeah.
but just make sure it's okay. So are you this, that? What kind of gift is it? Like revocable? So you'd kind of go through a manual.
Yeah.
And there were these proliferating manuals, of
Yes. Of course.
course,
Yeah.
especially from 17th century onwards, where you have these munshats, which used to be earlier these epistolaries of excellent prose, but they acquire these sections, which
Mm.
are really not of excellent prose, but they are of bog standard legal
Yeah.
documents.
This is
And
how
there
you
must have been a market for
draft
it.
it. Yeah. This is how you fill in a form,
Yeah,
basically.
this is how you fill in a form, and your even your district munshi can do this. But
Mm.
having said all that, I also don't want to kind of give the impression that this is completely mechanical.
Mm.
So Sumit Guha has a very interesting suggestion in his Margi Desi article, where he actually suggests that a lot of the openers and closers, the formulas in documents, are in
Yeah.
fact just phonetically memorized.
Right.
So scribes just reproduce those parts and the middle portions. And this is about Marathi documents, though. But
Mm.
you have like Persian phrases like written out in Marathi in the beginning and end. And in the middle, you have plain Marathi. And that's because you have these memorized phrases.
Right.
This doesn't work quite so well when you have entirely Persian documents because
Mm.
it's not quite the same thing. And the other thing is that you actually see small bits of innovations in every document, including really innovative curses as well, which are certainly not there in the formularies. But
Mm.
there's this beautiful curse, which is my favorite, in which this woman making a gift actually says, anybody who tries to intervene and encroach upon this gift I'm making,
Yeah.
on the day of judgment, I'm going to seize their daman.
Right.
And I thought that's fantastic, actually. this Hindu widow in the 1690s, in a document sealed by the Qazi in a district in Mughal India, says, making a gift to her nephew, says that on the Rose-e-Qiyamah, daman gire ushavam.
But that's relatively mild as well. I mean, she could have been much more colorful.
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah.
And maybe the Persianate actually reduces the colorfulness, because as we know of the curses, there are the infamous, for instance, the donkey curses of Gujarat, etc. So you don't quite get that.
Okay, cool. Can I guess, come back to the methodological issue, because towards the end, your methodological manifesto, as you put it right at the back. I mean, manifesto seems a bit like a bit more sort of radical than I think what you're really saying at the end of the book. I mean, what were you trying to do by calling it a methodological manifesto, and what is your methodological manifesto?
Well, to be honest, I thought several times whether I should actually include that word, on whether it was likely to make people really cross. Because whenever you say manifesto, of course, you look like a fanatic, and that's never a good look.
No.
And that wasn't the point. But the point was that I do think that there is a method which is actually very simple, but it's a donkey method. It's extremely hard work. That if emulated, can actually open up an enormous archive. And I use that archive in an abstract sense. It can open up several archives, in fact, which could really enrich our understanding of the Mughal past. And I think that there's need for doing that. So in the sense that a manifesto, I could have also said manual, but that's like the boringest thing ever. So what I really mean, that there is something, I think, in there that may be worth trying out by other people. And by that, I suggest, could people perhaps try stopping looking at these Persian documents in complete isolation and just talking of them like and a farman from Aurangzeb, as if it's some sort of gift from above. It has nothing behind, nothing ahead, and it has no context. I want people to actually think that there must be a continuing story of the transfer of obligations, of the creation of rights, of relationships within which these documents sit. And can people please also not just look at farmans, can they actually look at all levels of documents? Can they also read the parts of documents which are not in Persian? Could they actually try to put stories together? It is possible to do. I read again and again in various articles. It's not really possible to retrace, to reconstruct the story any longer. It is possible to reconstruct them, but you have to work very hard. You actually have to make your way over to the archives. You have to collect these documents. You have to actually date them. You have to create a spreadsheet, and you have to live with them for ages. But then you start actually tracing the relationships between people. And I think it comes down to that. So manifesto, I apologize to all those who hear me right now. It's not in character, but I did want to just get people's attention by using that term.
I mean, it's interesting because it's almost like you're appealing to a very different kind of connected history, but a connected history which is connected at the micro level, so that you basically get a richer and thicker kind of description analysis of a restricted archive, but still one which is not just a fairly random extant leftover from some conversation, but rather is part of this longer conversation within a particular space and time.
Yeah, so actually I dispute that, and I'll say how. It's not about a restricted archive. From one of the very kind peer reviewers of this manuscript, I received the warning, in fact, against using the term microhistory. Because the reviewer felt that would be a distraction, and it would lead to exactly the kind of view that you've just summarized, that this is about small and relatively insignificant stories. So it doesn't tell us anything broader, but maybe it tells us small, colorful stories that can add to the bigger story that we talk about. But as you know, that's not what microhistory is about. Microhistory is not about adding little dashes of color to a broader structure. It's about following the clues very carefully so that you begin to actually re-examine the essential connections between the parts of that bigger structure. So what I'm saying is, this myth of the centralized Mughal archive, which must have existed but has dispersed, and which corresponds to that. And here I am sticking my neck out, but which must have therefore corresponded to this centralized Mughal administration. And therefore, that is something that every fragment has to lead on to. That is the fallacy. I think the problem really is that people are plugging in isolated fragments into an imaginary structure.
Yeah,
I'm not saying that the Mughal state didn't have structures. It had structures. But like any functioning regime of that size, it had structures and moving parts at various levels. And what I'm trying to do is not actually just add a little spoke to the wheel. It's about showing you how the wheels really turned.
Cool. Well, thank you. I think that's been very interesting, not least because I guess you've indicated to us not just how rich this study is, and people should definitely go. And since the book is open source, people don't have an excuse not to read it.
Indeed.
It is available as open source on the Cambridge website. But in fact, that things like Bollywood films are relevant to the work of a Mughal historian, which
Always.
who knew? Well, yeah, exactly. Maybe not necessarily my kind of thing, but I'm sure there'll be others who might take that up. So anyway, that just leaves me to thank you, Nandini, for this wonderful conversation, which I think there's lots of things which we can follow up and maybe put. Good afternoon, and welcome to